Hey there, my name's Charles, and in this Networking 101 video, we're going to demonstrate how to connect to a PaaS service using a private endpoint. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to learn more about Azure. So most organizations are going to use a mix of virtual machines and PaaS services. Now, by default in Azure, most all PaaS services have a public DNS name and thus a public IP address. So if we have a virtual machine that is on our demo subnet, it's a private IP address for the virtual machine. If it's going to communicate with a storage account, which we would consider a PaaS service, then the communication, like the underlying routing, if you're going to go and look at a packet capture, the IP address of the storage account that it would use by default will be a public IP address. Now, of course, it's all like Microsoft internal routing. We're not really traversing the internet per se to go in and get to the storage account. But for some SOC teams, for some security teams, that's not acceptable, that it's using a public IP address. And so most all PaaS services support what are called private endpoints. And so what a private endpoint does is creates a private IP address on that virtual network or on a virtual network. It doesn't have to be the same one as the virtual machine. And then kind of changes the routing, changes the IP structure, changes the DNS resolution to say that now if we're going to communicate from a virtual machine on a virtual network to a storage account, to a SQL database, to Key Vault, to any of the PaaS services that supports private endpoints, then it'll use that private IP address. Now, one of the key things here is DNS resolution, because the DNS, the resolution has to occur within the virtual network that the private endpoint gets created on. If we try to communicate with, say, the same storage account that we're going to use in this example from anywhere else other than the virtual network, it's still going to resolve to that public IP address. So it's not that we're by default like changing the IP address on the resource. We're changing the DNS resolution so that when we say go to this storage account, that name translates to the private IP address from the virtual network and not the public IP address. So to kind of get this started here, we've got a virtual network created. We're just going to reuse our demo 1 virtual network. I have a storage account created just as an example. The process is pretty much the same for any other PaaS service. Doesn't matter whether it's a database or a Key Vault, an app service. The process is pretty much the same. So we'll take a look at these just with defaults again. And so I'll go into the storage account. I'm actually going to go create a container in the storage account just so that we have a like a demo container. And we will make it, private's fine. We'll click create. So now we have a demo container within within our storage account. So now if we were going to try to access, any file or if we're going to upload a file, access an object within our object storage here within our container, again, the DNS resolution is going to be to a public IP address. And let me just maybe create a file here. Notepad. Demo text file. Save that on the desktop real quick. Private endpoint demo file. Save. And then I will upload that file to our container. Upload. All right. So now if we look at this object, here is the URL of this file. Copy that, bring it back over here, maybe to a new notepad. font bigger so we can see it. All right, so here's the URL of this file. Now it's private. Like if I try to just, if you try to connect to this, the container is private. It's going to ask you for, it's probably going to give you an error because you didn't pass through any type of authentication. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, so here's the DNS name of this publicly accessible storage account. So it's the name of the storage account, SHWitch Demo 01. And because we created a container, it's blob storage. So the URL is .blob.core.windows.net. Now, if I open up a command prompt here, and yeah, that might be big enough. And then we just do a ping on this name just to see the resolution here. All right, so it doesn't matter that the ping's not going to work. The point is, if we ping the name of the storage account, notice it comes back with this public IP address. That's, again, default. And if we look at the configuration of the storage account on the networking of the storage account, the default configuration here from a firewall perspective is that public access is enabled. So anyone can at least try to connect to the storage account. Now, is there authentication? Of course. Like, in other words, it's not like by default this is just open and anything would be accessible. I had selected private for that container, so the container still needs authentication. But from a networking perspective, enabled from anywhere on the internet. That's the default configuration. And so what we can do with private endpoints is to say that, well, from a virtual machine in a virtual network on a subnet, if I try to access the storage account, I don't want to connect to this 52.public IP address. I want to connect to a private IP address in my virtual network. And so for that, on the PaaS resource that we want to do this on, in this case, our storage account, on the networking tab, we can go over to private endpoint connections and create a new private endpoint. So this is still another kind of object that gets created. We're essentially creating a network interface card that's going to be attached to our storage account. That's like an easy way to think of it. So naming convention, we'll call it private endpoint, storage account, and we'll just say subnet 0. That's the one that I'm going to, or demo VNet, storage demo VNet. And so it's going to create this network interface to kind of link the two together. So we'll select the resource. So notice it's asking for a target sub-resource, and because the resource type is a storage account, this dropdown is going to be the different resource types that a storage account supports. So notice, again, going back to our URL, we were trying to focus on blob objects. And so we would have to select blob here because different types of resources within a storage account have different URLs. If this was a file resource, it would be .file. Tables is .table. So the DNS name is different per type. So we'll select blob, go over to virtual networks. This is the virtual network and the subnet then that we want the private endpoint to be on. And so I'm going to select our demo 01 virtual network. We could select whether it goes on subnet 0, subnet 1. Maybe we create a dedicated subnet for the private endpoint. Whether you want it to be dynamically allocated or statically assigned. Click next here. The DNS name. So again, what we're really doing is changing the DNS so that when we resolve the storage account from within this virtual network, it comes back with the private IP address. And then our typical tagging, we can add tags if we wanted to, and then we can create the private endpoint, which I will do here. Now this may take an extra minute to create, but what it's going to do is go create that network interface card, kind of a virtual NIC, associate it with the storage account, also associate it with subnet 1 within our virtual network. And so now anything on that virtual network would be able to communicate with the storage account using the private IP address that gets allocated. Now I think I left the setting to dynamically allocate. So it's just going to grab the first available IP address in subnet 1, which should be .4 since we don't have anything else created in that subnet. So the storage account essentially is going to be 10.2.1.4. And so if we were a virtual machine, any other resource on that virtual network, if we wanted to communicate, connect to the storage account, we could still use the DNS name. It's just that it's going to resolve to 10.2.1.4, that private IP address, rather than that 52.public IP address. Now, again, that only changes it for the virtual network. If we still try to resolve the storage account name from outside of the virtual network, it's still going to resolve to that public IP address. And so then we have a choice of, is this storage account kind of like a mixed use case where some connections are private, some connections are public? In that case, maybe we leave the default setting so that everything is accessible from the internet. Or maybe we go back into that networking tab and restrict the network access to the storage account now, so that unless you're on this virtual network, you can't even communicate with the storage account. That would be the kind of the preferred security method, that, hey, like if this is an internal storage account, there's no reason for someone on the internet to try to be able to access it, even if they don't have an authorization token or something like that, that from a networking perspective, it's just unavailable. It's no longer on the internet. So this is almost done creating. Got a few objects created here. It should be just about finished. And then we'll go and take a look at the IP address that got created. Make sure that it's that 10.2 network that we were talking about. There we go. Deployment complete. We'll go to the resource. So here's the private endpoint. Again, it created this network interface. If we go into the network interface, we'll see that, yes, it is on that subnet 1 that we selected in our demo virtual network. And indeed, the first available IP address that it grabbed was 10.2.1.4. And so now, as long as the DNS resolution occurs from within this virtual network, from within our demo 01 virtual network, the IP address that the DNS would resolve to is 10.2.1.4. Now I can do the same thing externally. So this is still just on my computer here, not in the virtual network. If we try to ping again, it's still resolving to the public IP address, which is by design. So now we can go back to, say, the storage account. Take a look at our storage account, go back into the networking tab. Now notice that still public access is enabled from all networks. The private endpoint is there. So now it's kind of accepting connections on both. It's accepting connections on that 52 dot address as well as the private 10.2 address. And so for security perspective, we would probably at this point, if the storage account is meant for internal only access, it's only needed for internal organization, the application that's going to be running in Azure, anything like that, we would say that it's only enabled from specific virtual networks and IP addresses, and then we would add in our existing demo 01 virtual network, and maybe both of the subnets, right? At that point, it may or may not matter. It might be that we only want things on subnet 1, But here's where network security groups would also come into play. So if we have network security groups enabled or configured, we would customize those now on subnet 0, subnet 1, and we'd those same rules would apply now to try to connect to the storage account. So we could enable that here, and now the storage account would only be accessible from this virtual network. So that's private endpoints. That's how we add. There we go. And then save. So that's private endpoints. That's how we could connect privately from virtual machines, from other services on a virtual network to, in this case, a storage account. Again, the process is the same for other PaaS services. The private endpoint creation kind of does the same thing, regardless of whether it's a storage account, a SQL database, Key Vault. There's a number of services that support private endpoints. So if we need private communication from one service to another service, this is how we would do that. Thanks for watching. I hope you were able to take something away from this video. I create these on Twitch every week, every Friday afternoon. If you have any questions that you would like to come ask live and in person, feel free to come follow me on Twitch as well. Thanks for watching.